is Victoria Strombom. I'm a coastal real estate agent with Surterre Properties, and I have the pleasure of being here today with Ruben Gulledge, my broker at Surterre Properties. We wanted to talk to you today about a new form affecting buyers and sellers called the Fire Hardening and Defensible Space Form. This form affects 1 to 4 unit properties that are in high or very high fire zones. It's a new form, and there's many details we want to share with you that impact both buyers and sellers. Thanks for being here today, Ruben.
Thank you, Victoria. So the new form, it's really an advisory, a disclosure, and an addendum all in one. The advisory portion lets the clients know what defensible space and fire hardening really is, where to find information. The disclosure portion is the seller disclosing certain features they know or may know about the home that make the home more vulnerable to fire, like roof coverings that have untreated wood, single pane windows, dead dry foliage within certain proximity to the home. And then the addendum portion is an agreement between the buyer and the seller, where the seller is either going to have the local fire authority do an inspection and give a report of whether the property is in compliance or not, or in the alternative, agree that the buyer is going to assume the obligation to get compliance with state law within 1 year close of escrow.
So you see this as a 3-part disclosure, right? So we're going to break that down for you a little bit. How does a seller even know if a property is in a high fire or fire zone?
So the seller is going to look at the NHD report, the Natural Hazard Disclosure Report, to determine whether it is or is not in a high or very high fire zone.
Okay, so the NHD form is a report that we provide to buyers in escrow. The seller provides, it's done by a third party, so it will break down. So seller will know right away whether or not they're in a high fire or fire zone. So that would be basically an insight to, as we're completing these forms, maybe it's more prudent at that point for them to contact the local fire authority and have them evaluate the property.
Absolutely.
Okay. So you said something interesting though. You said that the seller can provide that report, or the buyer, if they don't receive that report, that the seller doesn't have an obligation to provide the report?
No, if they have a report, they always have the obligation to provide the report.
Got it.
But the seller's obligation under the law is either to provide the buyer with proof of compliance with the fire law,
yes,
or come to an agreement with the buyer that the buyer will comply with the fire law within 1 year of the close of escrow.
Okay, but the seller doesn't have an obligation to do the report.
That's correct.
And so that's where I was like, okay, wait a minute. The seller doesn't have the responsibility to do the report. How does the buyer know what they're going to have to comply with?
That's a good question, because the buyer can't order a government inspection on a seller's property. The buyer could find a third-party inspector that will do this inspection, or the buyer can ask during escrow that the seller do the inspection.
Correct.
And provide the report.
So my understanding too is that right now, for the most part, the fire authorities in the different cities are willing to provide the report for free.
That's correct.
But that each city is very different in how they're approaching these reports. So if it was me, I'm just putting myself in my seller's shoes or buyer's shoes. As a seller, I would want to get this information up front and disclose it so that I've done everything I can to inform the buyer buying my home of what their responsibilities, if any, are going to be.
That's right.
If I'm a buyer, I don't know that I would want to take on an unknown necessarily. Okay, so we have those sellers that are exempt from disclosure. For example, recent trust sales that I have completed, the sellers have no obligation to disclose because they don't know.
That's correct. This new law is tied to the TDS law transfer disclosure statement. So if the seller is exempt from providing the TDS, they're also exempt from providing this form and the disclosure.
I think the other part of this too is that whatever is discovered, if you're in a high fire zone as a buyer, you'll always want to make sure during the due diligence of inspection period that you're getting your insurance company to review the insurability of a home. So I think all of this kind of ties in. It's more than just a buyer and seller agreeing upon price. It's like all the other contingencies that will now come into play. Thinking ahead, 2020, hindsight being 2020, what would your suggestion be to our buyers and sellers?
So for the sellers, I would recommend having the inspection performed, calling the fire authority sooner rather than later, because right now they're coming out pretty quickly.
Right.
And my understanding, they're not charging at this time, but eventually they'll have to charge once it's factored into the budget. From the buyer side, I would recommend contacting your insurance agency early on to get that process started.
Exactly.
And also request of the seller that they have the inspection performed and provide the buyer with the report of completion.
Excellent. Thank you. I appreciate it so much. Great information, Ruben. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.